We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to The Anadromist. This is Burn Power coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia, which is a long way probably from wherever you are. Today what we're going to do is another lecture by Hans Rookmaaker. This is from 1976. It was originally given at the Westminster Theological Seminary. And again, this is the product of the last year of his life, and as he mentions in this lecture, he's been thinking about these things for 20 years. The title of the lecture is The 4 Points of Scholarship, which might sound like a dry topic, but it's Rookmaaker. It's never a dry topic. And what he is doing is discussing essentially how can we even discuss anything with each other. And of course, he's talking about on a scholarly level, how do we do research, how do we compare notes, but he's also talking about the very deep differences in viewpoint that people have, which is extremely important to understand in today's world if we want to get anywhere and not just demonize people on the other side of the fence. Now, this is an older recording. The sound quality is not up to shall we call it millennial snuff? So no comments about boomer sound. This is proto-boomer. Rookmaaker was more of a greatest generation person. Not that I'm a big fan of all this generational labeling. I think it's all kind of silly, frankly. But give this a listen. It's, again, the audience was a group of seminary students, so his comments are largely slotted towards Christians, but nevertheless, what he is saying can apply to anybody, and I would spend some time pondering what he's saying. He does not use philosophical language. He does this on purpose. He can read it, believe me. He references Michael Polanyi's book, Personal Knowledge, several times during this lecture. Personal Knowledge is a tough book to read. A great book, but a tough book to read. Rookmaaker always tries to bring things down to the level where anybody can understand what he's saying. And in fact, I think I inherited from Rookmaaker a kind of distrust of too much jargon in a, it's my feeling is if you can't put it into your own words, you don't really understand it yet. And it's easy to slide on the philosophical words. And he never allows one to do this. So, it's not going to be that hard to understand, but again, what seems simple is not. So, without any further ado, Hans Rookmaaker.
May I go into something which I have on my mind, which is, I think, important, and then I'm waiting for new questions, because I'm almost through. That's fantastic. Yes, there's quite a long list of it, but I think most basic questions have been answered. This is a kind of scheme that I've been developing in the last years. Oh, why should I take that book? I know it by heart. It is the 4 points. I'm thinking very much about where do we work as scholars. Where are our basic problems as scholars? So I'm just jumping out with the very practical little things that we're talking about. You see, $10 more or less, or $10 billion more or less. But now we're talking about sensible, very difficult things, scholarly problems. And I have 4 theses, and I just want you to think about them. They were implied in my very first lecture, and I want to make it explicit and I just want you to think about it. I began to think about it maybe 20 years ago, and I'm feeling that I've come to the point that I can give them in 4 points, which is simplification, and that from now on I'm going to work, and I hope that many people will join me. What do we do if we think as scholars? Whether we're theologians or art historians makes no difference. Point 1. Nothing is certain. Nothing is certain. It's very foolish for man to think that in any way whatsoever he can ever make an assertion which is certain. That he can ever stand out and say, this is how it is, and stop. No scholarship will ever be final. No scholarship can say you, this is how it is. Scholarship is a human endeavor, is made by man, and therefore not only open to sin and everything that goes with it, but it is finite and open to mistakes. And basically, and this is very important, what we do in our work is discussion. We discuss. So somebody says, this is how it is. Tomorrow one of your professors will will publish the final book on the interpretation of Matthew 12. The next day somebody writes a criticism, says he hasn't understood anything about it, it's totally wrong, and there goes your final book, and we're in the midst of the discussion. Of course, he gets an answer and some other answers, and 15 years later he said, wasn't that an interesting discussion? And we have one little inch in the understanding about Matthew 12, and I'm not thinking about any particular problem, I'm just mentioning something. And then go on to the next, and so this is life, this is our work. But the starting point in this is that nothing is certain, nothing is final, and we don't, it is just foolish to expect that we ever will get the final answer. And the worst place to look for is anything that is man-made. For instance, scholarship. Now this statement is a rather simplified and maybe, I hope, a rather violent statement against all popular belief today. Because everybody looks at science to give the final answers. And the final answers today are people expect to come from the scientists. Science and scholarship is the revelation that this world has and that it looks to. There we can know. You see, if somebody says, science has proved, everybody stops talking and says, yes, amen. No, they don't say amen, but the equivalent to that. You see? So we just accept it because it is science who has said it. Science has proved. Science has never proved anything. Science made an assertion, a tentative statement, which has to be proved to be true. And maybe it takes another 50 years that we found that it was completely wrong. I have found, maybe I said it before, but I'm re-saying it then, that the most dangerous statement is when people say, of course. Of course this is this like this. Well, if somebody says of course, then be very, very critical, because it means that most people agree. Well, if most people agree, it may be the superstition of our age. For instance, just to give you a nice little example, everybody today will say, of course, you have a subconscious. Well, I'm the only interesting guy in the company says, I don't believe you have a subconscious. Where does it come from? It's a little invention of Mr. Freud. It's not even 100 years old. Well, there's a little prehistory in the Romantic era. I know there's a man about 50 years before Freud who began to talk about it. And as another good friend of mine, he's one of the other crazy guys, you know, this man said, they have invented the subconscious in order to fill up the hole that the absence of God created. So, well, this is something to think about. This is not a final answer, this is just the beginning of a question. The beginning of a question, but I think questions are the most important things. Questions are the real things we're talking about, and if we have a good question, only then we can expect to have a good answer, or at least the beginning of an answer. So I have a question. I say, I don't think that there is something like a subconscious. So anybody who says, of course, then I would say, what are you talking about? Because these issues are very deep, but be very careful. Of course. I would say, of course, there is nothing like a subconscious. And then other people begin to get nervous, and that's fine. Let's be nervous. So nothing is certain. Never expect anything from human endeavor, because there's only one thing certain, and that is God. God is not a question mark, we are the question mark. God created, we are the creatures. Everything we do is relative. That means has only meaning in relationship to God. And we can never get out of that relativeness. It's not relativism, because then I cut God out and then I'm just wandering around without an answer. No, but I'm relative in relationship to God. And nobody can get out of that because we're creatures. If you know something about Doiwit, that's what Doiwit means, meaning. When he says meaning. That is what Schaeffer is talking about. But this is relationship. So God is certain. Everything that we do is uncertain. This was thesis 1. There are 4 theses totally, so we'll make it very soon. Not so difficult. Thesis 2. There are many, many, many things which are totally certain. I am very certain that I'm sitting at this moment on a table, speaking in a room, with a microphone before my head to a bunch of Americans. And anybody would say that's a foolish statement, that's totally uncertain. I would say either you got to go to the hospital or, well, there's something wrong. This is totally certain. There is no problem in my mind that at this moment we are in a suburb of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, United States, the earth, this universe. Okay, that's the address. You see? There's no problem. We're quite certain about it. I'm very certain that the person who is sitting on the first line here is a woman. And I don't need to see her birth certificate to know so. And she doesn't need to prove it just by all the nudity we're talking about this morning. You see? Because she is a woman. And I would be very surprised if she wasn't, if she was a transvestite. That could happen. That kind of, but it is just the strangeness of transvestite that it is something strange because it falls out of, well, let's say, obvious experience. These chairs are blue. Don't say me that is a relativistic statement. They could be just as well red. Well, of course, they could be changed and you could repaint them, but they are blue. It's winter. It's still daytime. Well, I just can go on. I can go on for hours and hours. And if you drive through the landscape, it's foggy. Some friend of yours is taking you to an unknown country, and you drive up the mountain, and then a friend says, now, wait a minute. At this point, it would be a lovely view. Of course, we don't see anything at this moment because it's all the fog. But if there was no fog, it was a lovely view. Most of us would not say, how do you know? Can you really prove this? I don't believe you before I've seen it. No, we will say, well, I was sorry, very sorry that I didn't see the lovely view that you talked about, because we take things, well, certainties. Human, well, if he was a lunatic, or if there was another situation, maybe I would say I doubt what you say. But usually we take these things for granted. And we cannot live without it. Life would be completely unbearable if we had not these certainties. The certainties that, well, just drive on a highway. 60 miles an hour. What you are really confident in that 200 yards away from you, the road is still there. You're not driving in a big hole. It may be that by an earthquake there is a big hole and you fall into it. Well, then we talk about the disaster. It's in the paper next day. But you're not driving on that assumption, because then you wouldn't be driving at all. You see, there may be things like this, and maybe they warn you, be careful, there might be something like that happening. But certainly we just live on certainties. I wouldn't dare to go to New York if I didn't know that New York existed, although I've never been there before. The plane is landing somewhere. But it's on the map. Well, the map refers to somebody's experiences, and we know where we can. We know even, and in real life, not in philosophical life, everything is a problem. That's point one. But in points two, many things are very certain. So we know, well, this is human experience, and we draw the line very finely between reality and fantasy. In the beginning of this book by Tolkien, there's a big map. It's a fantasy map. Well, the map that I get here at the gas station is a reality map. Both are maps. Nobody will confuse the two. And so there are many things are certain. This is very important, because this certainty is exactly what we are to think about. Because it's a given. So I would say the most Christian thing in the world, and this is the basis of everything that we say, thank you, Lord, that you gave me this world, that you gave me my existence in the midst of this existence which we call creation. And this is the certainty that you made it. The end of this fantastic chapter in the Bible, Revelations 5, is the great song in the heavens of the 24 elders, that praise be unto the God who is the creator, and nothing is there but he willed it to be. And that's the basis of our acceptance and the certainty. It's based in which I ended with the first talk. Our certainty is God who created. Well, that's the certainty that we talk about. Now, that certainty creates problems, this type of problem that we want to know. We want to investigate. We want to understand. And nobody will stop us, because that's one of the things we are called to do. So God says, go ahead, investigate, try to find out, think about it. And so we go into it, and we find out in the physics, macrophysics, microphysics, but also psychology, sociology, aesthetics, and so on and so on. And what we try to understand is exactly the given, that what is certain. I stand before the painting and I say, is that a beautiful painting? That's human certainty. Now the statistician comes and he says, why is it beautiful and what does it mean? And now we get into the uncertainties. Of course, everything I've been saying in this course is uncertainty, belongs to chapter 1. But the paintings that I was projecting were slides after pictures. That was a certainty. And I couldn't make my lectures if I had not something to walk on and say, well, there is a Rubens. There is a Rubens, and it depicts these men and women and these horses and so on. We discussed it the whole day yesterday. Well, we talk about something that's there. Now, what does it mean? How do we interpret it? What are the values? Well, many problems, questions, approaches, discussion. Well, that's fine. That's human. That's point two. And I think that's the most Christian point to begin with. It is, we don't start with thinking, but we start with accepting reality as something outside. And never follow those people who say, of course, these things are our thought forms. Of course, we make it. It comes of our brain. Evil things, witchcraft, conjuring things, and so on. Yes, where are they? In our brains and imagination, I would say you have a great imagination, but it's outside. It's there to begin with. Be afraid of it. Schaeffer just had a very interesting story last night. He told me, told another people too, that in Uganda there was a witch, and the witch called in the Christian, the pastor, and he said to the pastor, I want to be a Christian. And in order to be a Christian, I want to get rid of my witchcraft things. So they are buried in the back of the garden. And so the Christian pastor said, okay, I will ask some of my friends to come and dig it up. And 2 students, like you, came in order to dig up the things in the back of the garden. Within 2 hours, they couldn't dig anymore because their hands had got lame. They couldn't move anymore. Well, this was a great victory, of course, for the non-Christian powers in the country. Schaeffer's answer is, why were the hands lame? Because these kids didn't believe that there was real power there in the garden. They didn't pray before they go. They were not there as believers in the sense that the God is the God who is more powerful than the evil powers. No, they were just digging up some little stuff that some old, foolish, old-fashioned fantasy person like a witch doctor has buried there. And so we're just easily disposing of it. But God had to teach them, no, these things are real. And if you want to believe in me, you got to believe also in the realities of evil. You see, something like this. So it's out there. And I think that's very important. It's, of course, and this again goes against all the grains of current popular thinking. Everybody thinks different. And I think it's very important. Point 3, all our experience is colored by our starting point. All our experience is colored by our starting point. If you are a Christian, look at the world with the Christian glasses. If you are a communist, you have red glasses. If you are a humanist, you have green glasses. If you are a Hindu, you have blue glasses, and so on and so on. I believe, but that's my belief, and of course my own glasses are implied. I believe that the Christian glasses are white, so that they don't disfigure reality. But that's my faith. Very hard to prove. So, what is the difference between my view and the view of Gombrich, who is a very fine humanist, and his friend Panofsky, and Antal, who is a Marxist, or Baxanel, who is another type of Marxist? What is our difference in our views? Or rather, how can we ever communicate? And I would say it's like this. Well, first, the difference. The difference is this, and this is a kind of metaphor that I've made for this. Well, just think about it a moment. I have in front of me tea, coffee, Coke, 7-Up, wine, sherry. Think about something else. You can add to the line. What is the difference between all these things before me? Well, in fact, the difference is very little indeed. What's the difference between tea and coffee? It smells differently, it tastes differently, and it has a completely different meaning. You see, whether you offer somebody a glass of wine or a cup of coffee is a total different gesture. Some may be right and some may be wrong at some moments. Some people you don't offer wine because they think they don't have the taste for it, and so on. You see, so you got to be careful. But these things have meaningfulnesses. But in what do they differ? Well, interestingly, if you begin to think about it, they differ in 5%. Tea and coffee is both 95% water, and so is Coke, and so is most of the wine, etc., that we drink. It's mostly 95% water, but the 5% exactly counts. And so, to translate this metaphor back into the things we are thinking about, my experience and the experience of Mr. such and such the Marxist, and Mr. so-and-so the Maoist, and Mr. so-and-so the fundamentalist, and Mr. so-and-so the modern theologian, and Mr. so-and-so who is just simply a right-wing conservative without believing anything. Well, all these people, they're all the same insofar they're all human, and for 95% they all have the same experience. And the coloring or disfiguring, whatever it is only 5%. That means, and that's the basis of the last point, that there can be communication. Because we have so much in common. We are not just differently, we're not just glasses, to use the other metaphor, colored glasses, but we have eyes and we see, and there's an outside world that we look at. So there is a very direct relationship, and there is something that we go by. So there is all our experience is colored by our starting point. That means at the same time that goes against the grain of all modern scholarly superstition that you can ever get at objective results. People ask me, my students ask me, we want to have objective truth. And I answer them, you're a fool, because that would be unhuman. What you can get from me is personal knowledge. And I'm quoting the title of that very important book of Polanyi that I think should be on the proscribed reading of every theologian, including the people here, of course. So I think you've got to read that book, Personal Knowledge. We can never go beyond personal knowledge, and we should never try to do that, because as soon as we go beyond that, we don't know anything anymore, because it becomes totally unnecessary, becomes totally unhuman knowledge. What the computer knows is usually completely superfluous knowledge. We see today that under the aegis of this, more and more historians begin to republish old things. So in the end you have a complete library of republications of old things. But nobody ever reads them and tries to assess what they mean, because then it becomes personal and subjective. And of course they become personal and subjective, but that's exactly what's worthwhile talking about. You see, and just the republication in the end becomes an escape. And that's what we call scholarly. And I think the scholarly thing is just a real phony thing. That's just a superstition of our age. As Christians, as a Christian, I say no to that. I don't want to fall in that. And I teach my students, you're fools. You're asking for something which is strange and which is nonsensical. You want to be human, and you cannot escape being human. Why should you try to escape to be human? And of course, it's so fascinating that we as human can say things which are real. And we start from such a strong reality, and that we are completely certain about. That beautiful painting by Rubens. And now we go into interpretations. Of course, all my interpretation is my personal knowledge. And nobody can do it in this way. Nobody has ever talked about that Rubens in my way. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to say, look how great I am. I'm only saying that that's what I cannot avoid being. That is me. And of course, everybody else who would talk about it would just as well talk in a personal way about it. Well, let's what we say personally be of good standards. That's another thing. Let's try to talk sense. Try to get deep into things, of course. There are standards of knowledge. But I'm not talking about the standards, I'm talking about the quality of it, the personality of it. And it's colored. So no experience is without coloring, which is a qualification of what I said in the second statement. I said everything, there are many things that are certain. In the third thing I say, everything that we talk about in saying it's certain is colored by our understanding. Of course it is. Now point 4, and this is, I think, the real mystery. It's a real mysterious point. I must say that I don't understand. I wished I could explain. If I could explain, I was the greatest philosopher of all ages. course, there has been much thought on this point. Of course, I don't think there has been enough thought on this point. The point is the point of communication. Although we do communicate out of our experience, and we can only see the world through our colored glasses, nevertheless we can communicate. One of the reasons that we are creatures in creation, so that we're 95% water in my equation, in my metaphor. You see, so we can talk. We can talk. But the wonder of it is the real miracle, the real mystery also, because I can't explain it. And it's just like this. Mr. A writes a play. And the play is played in the theater. Mr. A was an existentialist. Mr. B is a humanist. Mr. B looks at it and he writes a criticism. Of course, looking with his eyes at that play and interpreting it in his way. And there's a clash of opinion there. Then Mr. C reads the criticism of Mr. B. He is one of your nice little Christian friends. Now, this Mr. C talks to you, you're D. The interesting thing is that in listening to them, it's not very difficult to reconstruct the play A to know what it was about, because you understand that your Christian friend misunderstood, of course, completely what Mr. B meant when he said this and this and this in talking about A. And you understand that B was a man of that and that color, and that's why he said it that way. So it's not difficult to reconstruct in your mind what A was about. But not only that A was, of course, a specific vision on reality, but you can even find out what the reality it is talking about. And I think that's a real mystery, how you can explain these things, these very complex communications. I just give you a very simple example. But that's the way that we read books. In a book you have a quote, and the quote talks about another man, and that man talks about another man again. And that talks about reality, and you say, and you can compare. He said that all the hills are green. Are hills green? Yes. So at least as far as he's talking about the fact that hills are green, he is not completely foolish. He is right to a certain extent, but he also says this, and there he misses the point. So you can't compare him to reality because you know about the reality that he's talking about. Although you have your glasses on, and they all have their glasses on. And they differ as much as tea and coffee and coke and wine. That's a real mystery. And I think that's the basis of all our work. Of course, it's a difficulty. It's complex. And it's the basis, of course, also of hermeneutics. If you read the Bible, people are talking, they are giving sermons. The Bible is one big sermon about the God who created this world and the greatness of this world, etc., etc. But you can read it and understand it, and you know, oh yes, everybody understands, because the colored glasses can be deep problems, problems about the basic points in the existence and so on and so on, basic questions of epistemology. But it can be as very superficial as just the social environment. Not superficial in the sense of not important, but not very deep in the spiritual sense. So, for instance, in my church, and every Sunday they read the law. And so every Sunday people listen to the very important statement that they should not covet the ass of their neighbor. Now, of course, nobody in my community living in the city of Amsterdam would ever love to have an ass. That was the greatest burden in the world. It was just the most thing everybody dreams about of never having. And the neighbors don't have it. So it's a silly statement. Don't covet the ass of your neighbor. No, but because everybody understands that's not what it's talking about. Everybody understands what it does talk about. And that's why we can have this communication. It's not foolish to say so. And we immediately, everybody, not only the learned and the wise, but even the foolish, the children, immediately take away, they put on their glass and take away the other glass and look at the reality of the big things that other people have, our own sinfulness, because we want to have it too, our pride, our greed, and all these things. And we know the Lord says, be careful, don't touch. Very simple. No, very simple, very complex as communication, if I begin to think about it. Now, all the theories I may build on it fall under statement 1. They're all uncertain, they all fall below the line of interpretation, but we first got to accept, and I think it belongs to the certainties of B, that these things are like this. Where is the Bible in my story? I think it belongs to B, the certainties that we cannot discuss. The coveting of the ass of our neighbor. The things the Bible talks about, God created the world, they don't belong to human uncertainties. That's where the modern theologians place them, because they think that they're man-made statements. But I say, although man was implied, although it's personal knowledge, and therefore important knowledge, the knowledge of Moses and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Paul, it's exactly the great miracle again that it's so personal, but nevertheless states universal, and that universal is in the realm of the same kind of realm when I say it's raining outside, the sun is shining, we are sitting in a room, some of you are men, some of you are women, we have light turned on, I hear the heating system, rather annoying. Why don't you Americans invent a better heating system that doesn't make noise? These things, very certain. You see, these are the points that I wanted to point out and I want to bring to you. I think that they are very important. If we have time, maybe tomorrow I can go into art history as a discipline and what it means. I even have a lecture on certainty in science, scholarship, art history, but and it would be interesting to discuss that because you look at a different angle, and so you maybe the confrontation of people from different disciplines is helpful. I don't know how far we get, but first we're going to now have a little intermission. I hope to get many more questions so we can do something this afternoon. I won't make it too late because I got to hop over to the other place.
Well, I hope you found that interesting. I heard that it's part of a larger series that he did at Westminster Seminary that had a lot of questions about art, but this one didn't have any particular relevance to art specifically. Now, there's a couple mentions, but I find that these concepts, if you really think about them, are extremely useful in so many different ways. He's talking about scholarship, but he could also be talking about dialogue on YouTube, or how to talk with your friends, to respect their humanity, to realize they're coming out of certain glasses. Of course, the big issue, which he doesn't address, is, well, my friend's wearing the red glasses, I want them to wear clearer glasses. How do I get them to do that? Well, that, of course, is something much broader, and he's asking us to think. Rookmaaker often ends with questions rather than answers, and there's a reason for that, as he explains in the lecture. First, you need good questions. Well, this is Bern in Tbilisi, reminding you that anadromous is a word related to fish swimming against the stream to get back home. And that's what I'm inviting you to do.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.